So good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's Institute, Historical and Community Trauma, Connections to Current Outcomes and Inheriting Resilience. This is part 2 of the 3-part trauma-informed care series that we are hosting in collaboration with the Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative and presented by Madison Hammett. So my name is Courtney Cintron, Partner Engagement Specialist with Ingenuity, and I am feeling very grateful to be here with you all this morning. As many of you know, over the past several months, or if you're new, you may not know, through the Arts Ed Response Collective, Ingenuity has convened arts education stakeholders from across the arts education sector to gain a better understanding of what the emerging challenges have been during this time shaped by COVID-19, the economic downturn, and the anti-racism movement. For students, for educators, for schools, for arts organizations, and philanthropists. We also came together to begin proactively addressing the changing landscape and its effects on arts education through collective impact work and stakeholder recommendations. So one of the shared desires and values that emerged during this process was to really understand how to best prepare educators for the needs of students in the coming year, especially as the disparities and the impact of the pandemic on communities of color across the city came into focus. So one of the universal recommendations that emerged during these conversations was an embrace of trauma-informed practice and an equity mindset in our teaching practices and work. So the trainings that we are presenting with the Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative are a starting point in this process. The sessions discuss the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study as a starting point. Today's session will also discuss the background of historical and community trauma, and then participants will learn what they can do to promote resilience, recovery, and thriving individuals and communities within their work, and the role that art plays in addressing and preventing the effects of trauma. So, like I said, this is one of many more trauma-informed trainings to come this year, and we will continue to bring you various voices, perspectives, and resources on the topic throughout the year so that we can really begin to think about sustaining this work and embedding it in our organizations and practices in the classroom. And so with that, I'm going to give you a couple of updates and then some housekeeping items, and then I'll kick it off to Madison and we'll get started, okay? So as a quick update, starting off our professional learning season for the upcoming school year is the Partner Starter Institute, which is a 5-part video series released during the first week in August. And in this series, members of Ingenuity, the CPS Department of Arts Education, and the partner community will be coming together to discuss how COVID-19, the economic downturn, and the anti-racism movement will require shifts in thinking and practice and provide resources to help you navigate partnerships during this time. We'll also be hosting a live Partner Starter Q&A session on Friday, August 7th. And for a schedule of topics and release dates, you can check back on our website at ingenuity-inc.org. Okay, so just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started here. If you haven't already, if you can please be sure to rename yourself and include your pronouns as well as your organization's name, that would be greatly appreciated. If you have any questions during the session, you can feel free to utilize the chat box. So there will be time for a Q&A at the end and we'll address any questions then. If it's an urgent technical issue, I will also be monitoring the chat and check in on some of those questions. And lastly, please note that we are recording the session, but we will be excluding the discussion at the end from the recording. So you don't need to feel like you have to hesitate in your participation. We won't be recording that portion. Okay, so joining us today is Madison Hammett of the Illinois ACEs Response Collaborative. The collaborative is a broad range of multi-sector stakeholders committed to expanding the understanding of trauma and adverse childhood experiences and their impact on the health and well-being of Illinois youth, families, and communities and systems. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Madison. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I am gonna just dive right in with the content and how we're gonna move forward. But like Courtney said, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in the chat box. And we'll have a couple of spots plus the Q&A at the end to address some reflections as well. So just before we start though, I wanted to take some time to provide a content warning about some of the items we're going to be covering today. You know, this training is of course about trauma, so we should always be aware of that potential impact when we're discussing it. But we also want to provide these additional warnings for specific topics since we are talking about historical and structural trauma. And so I wanted to let you know that these things might be mentioned or shown, however briefly, and encourage you to take care of yourself. And if you need to leave at any point, please feel free to do so and contact me, and I can give you the information you might have missed or anything like that. So some things that we'll be covering include adverse childhood experiences, including child abuse, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, racism generally, but in particular anti-Black racism here in the United States, colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow and segregation, police violence, including that against children, anti-Latinx xenophobia, Islamophobia, and community violence, including gun violence. So again, please take care of yourselves. And if you need to step away and would like more information, please feel free to contact me. I also wanted to take note about the language we're going to be using today. So this presentation is going to be using terms like trauma and resilience, since those are the most widely accepted and used ones in peer-reviewed literature. However, and I say this with a big however, these don't always resonate with people. So you might have heard or prefer terms like adversity or thriving, rebirth, renewal. There's all sorts of things, and maybe even something else I haven't said. All of those are great. You know, if you have something that you prefer and you want others to know about, please share that in the chat box, or we can discuss during the reflection and Q&A sessions. Very straightforward, our agenda for today. So we're going to talk about trauma beyond ACEs and what that actually means. So for those of you who joined us in our last training, we'll do a little bit of a recap on what ACEs are and what that expanded definition of trauma is. And then we're going to go into a deep dive of the collective experiences, the historical trauma with some specific examples from partners of ours, as well as community trauma and how that plays into implicit bias. Then we're going to talk about what that actually does to our body and what the outcomes of those experiences are doing to us. And then we'll get a little bit even more concentrated and talk about what's going on here in Chicago and, how can you take this knowledge and utilize it in your work, whether that be in the actual arts programming you do, but maybe also in your day-to-day activities with your coworkers or your family or any other, relationship that you might have. So just to get started, trauma beyond ACEs. So talking about how the adverse childhood experience study really set the stage for this work. So the adverse childhood experience study, for those of you who are not familiar, is a broad logistical study that, longitudinal study that looked at the traumatic experiences of adult patients who had reported health problems. And so it asked 10 questions about their experiences in childhood related to trauma. And these were all individual experiences of trauma. So it was things like child abuse, whether it be physical, emotional, or sexual, physical neglect or emotional neglect, and then household stress. So did anyone in your family experience a mental illness that was left untreated, struggle with substance use disorder, was a victim of domestic violence, incarcerated, or were you forcibly separated from your parents, whether that be through divorce, as it asked in the original, or there are other types of forcible separation, as we all know, whether that be through something like the foster care system or the immigration system. So it asked these 10 questions, and what it found was that trauma was incredibly common. 60% of respondents had at least one example of childhood trauma. But even then they knew that this was a limited view of trauma and adversity. They were bound by the constraints of a study which was funded by the federal government. But what this did do was give people a jumping off point. If these 10 experiences were so common, how common then must other types of trauma be? And so we always keep these 10 original ACEs in mind, not as the endpoint of childhood trauma or childhood adversity, but rather the jumping off point and how it really set into motion this modern study of trauma and its effects on biology and development. Because not only did they find that ACEs were incredibly common, they found that those who'd experienced childhood trauma were more likely to have, as an adult, things like cancer, diabetes, depression, struggles with substance, as well as social outcomes like divorce, less likely to have graduated high school, less likely to be able to hold down a job. All of these things that we consider being part of a healthy, lifespan were much more difficult if you'd experienced childhood trauma. So that set off this question then, though, of if those 10 ACEs are so influential and can have such an impact on health, to the point that if you have 6 or more, you're at risk for a shortened lifespan of up to 20 years. If it's that impactful on your health, what are the traumas that we didn't look at doing? So this really kickstarted this revolution, if you will, into looking at different types of trauma. And so this is tree. In trauma, there's a lot of tree and branches metaphors, and this is one of them. This tree represents the expanded view of trauma and adversity and encourages us to look at that broader, more systemic framing. So up at the top there of the tree, the leaves and branches, the most easily identifiable, we have adverse childhood experiences and those 10 instances of childhood trauma. But what we want to look at too is, how are these leaves and branches growing? What's making them take shape the way they do? And so you start looking at the roots and looking at things like adverse community environments, items like poverty and community violence, lack of educational and economic opportunities, poor housing, racism, discrimination. All of these feed into making childhood trauma either feel more profound or enhanced, or they can, in some instances, actually create the environments in which these individual traumas take place. And then even deeper than that, we want to start looking at adverse collective historical experiences. Trauma does not exist in a vacuum. Our individual experiences don't exist in a vacuum. So we want to look then at what is the cause, what is the root of this issue, and what's the soil that's feeding it, so to speak. And these are things like slavery, genocide and the Holocaust, forced displacement, mass incarceration. All of these are giving, life to these traumas. They're feeding into it. So how do we address the soil is what we want to look at. And we want to look at that because we know that trauma and toxic stress are related. So if you were on the last training, this slide is familiar to you as well. But we need stress. It's important to keep us alive, and we need it to get to our appointments on time. We need it to jump out of the way of a car if it goes through a stop sign. But that response to stress, that fight, flight, or freeze, that can be too much of a good thing if we are constantly exposed to trauma and stress. We get stuck in that hyper-aroused state where we're constantly panicked or anxious, or we might have a hair trigger temper, the things that people often associate with post-traumatic stress. Or alternatively, we might get stuck in the hypoarousal, where we have depression, a flat affect, feeling exhausted all the time, chronic fatigue. Too much of those hormones of adrenaline and cortisol, the things that are keeping us alive when we're under stress, too much can actually wear our body down. And the same thing that happens to an individual who's experiencing trauma firsthand can also happen to those who see trauma from a distance. For example, after 9/11, many Americans reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress from constantly being exposed to images of the World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks. They hadn't been in New York City or Washington, D.C., but just seeing those images over and over again on the television created the same symptoms of traumatic stress that it might have for someone who was on the sidewalk or a survivor. Or hearing about it after the fact, we know that that also causes traumatic stress. We hear about that in health practitioners or therapeutic services, teachers, people who hear other people's stress and other people's trauma can also in turn develop symptoms of traumatic stress. And so when an individual or group experiences a trauma, their behavior adapts to surviving that, even if that behavior could be potentially damaging to their health or social relationships. So, with this original ACEs study, it actually was born out of, why do people smoke if they know it's bad for them? Why can't my overweight patients lose the weight when they know that they should diet and exercise? And the two doctors, Dr. Anda and Dr. Filiti, who were the heads of this study, will now say that those are no longer issues that doctors should be looking at. You shouldn't be looking at, why is my patient not quitting smoking, in the terms of that's a health behavior problem they can't overcome, but rather, what is my patient dealing with that they're using smoking to address? What is this adaptive behavior in addressing? So these do not exist in a vacuum, and it's the same thing for these larger traumatic experiences, which can impact the body just like individual trauma and the toxic stress people feel when they are individually experiencing trauma. So I give you that brief outline of what ACEs are and what individual trauma can do to your body, and then also how we have seen those same effects in collective trauma, because I think it's really important to keep that in mind as we walk through these big ideas like historical trauma. It makes a lot of sense for most people that if something bad happened to you as an individual in childhood, it might impact your health later on. But it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to conceptualize things that happened hundreds of years ago impacting an individual's health. But when we talk about historical trauma and these structural traumas, keep in mind too of how are these integrated into our everyday lives, and how are we still being exposed to the remnants of these traumatic experiences? So what is historical trauma? Historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from a massive group trauma. This wound can be the result of a single event or from generations of repeated trauma. And it was first observed in the 1960s when children of Holocaust survivors were presenting with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They reported symptoms like survivor guilt, anxiety, anger, grief, depression, self-esteem issues, as well as things like a preoccupation with death, substance abuse, or exaggerated personal attachments and interdependency on relationships, so toxic personal relationships. These were all things that psychologists at the time expected to see in their parents or their relatives who had survived the Holocaust. This is what people associated with traumatic experiences. But it was a new idea that these children of Holocaust survivors were exhibiting the same symptoms of post-traumatic stress that their parents were. And even though that they had not experienced the events of the Holocaust themselves, they still reported symptoms commonly associated with survivors, and specifically high levels of anxiety when the Holocaust or surrounding events were mentioned, uncontrollable fear of elements that they associated with the Holocaust, so things like large dogs, trains, military, medical personnel. And these patients also reported, what at the time was called familial dysfunction. They had little to no communication with their parents. They reported emotional neglect and attachment issues, feeling isolated. All of this is something that, again, they expected in survivors, but to see it in the children of survivors who had not experienced the Holocaust firsthand was a bit of a revelation. And those additional elements too come from what Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is a social scientist at the University of Minnesota, calls historical unresolved grief. And she says that this grief accompanies trauma and manifests throughout generations, including those who can be long removed from an actual traumatic event, because a trauma has not been addressed sufficiently within one generation and thus becomes part of that community's culture and passed on throughout the generations. So since that initial historical trauma studies in the 1960s looking at the children of Holocaust survivors, significant research has been done into multiple populations and conducted around the world, including in Japanese Americans who are the descendants of those who survived at the internment camps during World War II, Native American and Alaskan Natives, and Black American communities to examine the relationship between historical trauma and current health and social outcomes. Studies have also been done in other countries like Canada, looking at First Nations and Japanese Canadians who were also interned during World War II. In the United Kingdom, with survivors of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And then in Australia and New Zealand with Aborigine and Maori populations. So these have been, replicated in multiple sites throughout the world, and they are still seeing a reflection of that trauma being passed down, seeing the same physical symptoms, and in some cases, social outcomes that we associate with post-traumatic stress. Seeing people who are dealing with, anxiety, depression, poor relationships, but also seeing people who on paper are the same as other populations and yet have more difficulty obtaining high school diplomas, graduating college, or attending, maintaining a job, maintaining a relationship. All of these things that we saw in the original ACEs studies with those social outcomes are reflected in these people who are experiencing the remnants of historical trauma. And historical trauma is a very broad term, though. And here in the United States, we are starting to look at it with an even more concentrated and nuanced point of view, because we know the United States is unique in the types of historical trauma that we see present. All of these studies have been done around the world, and while colonialism and racism are present everywhere, it's within the United States that we have a population that not only underwent a significant trauma for hundreds of years, but is still feeling the remnants of that trauma in multiple nuanced ways. And so when we look at Black Americans in particular, we want to also look at the subsequent traumas that were built into the system, even post-slavery. And I say all of this not with the framing of this only happens to Black Americans, or that there is something that is inherent within a community that causes trauma, but more so to remind us that this country is particularly founded on racism and has it built into the systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to talk about one thing in particular. So this idea of segregation stress syndrome and how it connects today with the policing of young Black children. And this comes from a partner of ours at the collaborative, the sociologist, Dr. Ruth Thompson Miller. She actually presented a much longer hour-and-a-half webinar on segregation stress syndrome last year, and that's available on our website if this is of interest to you. And what Dr. Thompson Miller proposes is that the trauma that African Americans endured under slavery and Jim Crow has been intergenerationally transmitted to children, grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. and that this trauma influences their current relationship to police and the current trauma born from that relationship. So what Dr. Thompson Miller does in this is she reminds us that Jim Crow was legal and embedded into the system, and echoes of that are still present in legal systems throughout the United States, not just in certain areas or communities, but every single facet of American law enforcement, American penal system, everything that connects to what we would call the justice system is still influenced by these early days of first slavery and then Jim Crow. Police during this time committed mass violence, both in uniform and as members of the Klan, behaviors that were used to keep people safe from these dangers of the police. Dr. Thompson Miller found that they were passed down through generations, and even if they weren't explicitly connected to Jim Crow. So what Dr. Thompson Miller did was she interviewed more than 100 Black Americans in the Southeast and Southwest who had survived Jim Crow, and found outcomes very similar to that first study done on children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So she found those adaptive behaviors such as hypervigilance, the need to warn children and grandchildren about individuals or systems that inflict trauma, so passing down safety planning and safety information. She compared it to, in that original study, many Jewish families reported having a suitcase packed away just in case they needed to leave very quickly, of always having their papers ready to go in case they needed to leave, even if there was no immediate danger that they could prove. It was still having that security of, I am always ready to leave if I need to. She compared that to this. You always are ready and know how to act and know how to protect yourself just in case. And she also saw, again, those same memories that are triggered by symbols of Jim Crow and police brutality, things that we now see on the television every single day. And so not only were they triggering in a present sense of, this is upsetting and traumatizing to me, seeing it in the present sense, but also she found that those who had not even lived through Jim Crow, who were, the people's children and grandchildren, they still felt those same feelings of anxiety when presented with those images and connecting them to the police. She also talked about the adaptive behaviors, and we'll talk about this when we get to resilience, of talking about behaviors that help people stay safe and feel comfortable or continue, avoiding violence or things like that. She talked about that in the sense that people pass them down and may not even know that this is a part of that, may not feel like they are doing something in a response to Jim Crow, but rather, oh, this is something we have always done. So she talked about multiple interviewees who said their grandparents always keep the blinds closed and lights off even when it was dark. That was just something they did. And she saw that connection across the country, actually. But she only actually had 3 people in these hundreds of interviews who were able to give a concrete reason behind it. And one of them was, my grandmother taught me to do that because when she was a child in Mississippi, the Klan wouldn't be able to see inside and know that they were home or who was in there. So that's why we always keep our blinds closed. There's no reason to let people know who's inside your home. And so she had, that person and a couple of others make that connection. But when she asked others, they just said, oh, that's just something we've always done. And so she also connects this idea of, we pass down survivorship traits and we pass down things that we say, oh, that's just how we do it in my family, or that's just like a cultural thing, that are actually adaptive behaviors to stress. She also argues, though, too, that in passing down these behaviors and in, keeping these things sort of confined to the knowledge of the Black community, that this allows the country as a whole to whitewash the Great Migration. She argues that, you know, when we talk about the Great Migration as a country, we're talking about it as Black people moved up north for opportunity, and look at it almost strictly through an economic standpoint of, oh, they just needed better jobs. But what she says is we should actually be viewing that as akin to a forced migration or a refugee crisis, even though, or an internally displaced people's crisis. You know, this is due to violence and ethnic cleansing, like what you see in this picture. This is a picture of Tulsa after the massacre, which has, you know, sort of come into the spotlight more because it's been depicted in popular media. But before items like Watchmen, this was not something part of the larger American conscious. And people, particularly white people, did not learn about it. And so she argues that this has allowed us to whitewash the Great Migration and view it as just something that happened to happen. But then what she also argues is through that whitewashing of the Great Migration, it allows us to not make the connections between Jim Crow and modern day policing. Because what she found is that Black children were using the same tactics their grandparents and great-grandparents used to stay safe during Jim Crow. They're using them to stay safe from police officers. And this screenshot of you see of this young boy being arrested, she included this and to go with a video, and he's 10 years old and being arrested, and you can hear his grandmother off screen giving him advice and telling him how to act and how to stay safe. And she's imparting this knowledge that she gained through Jim Crow. And she saw that she saw that children had a very deep knowledge of how to stay safe at a very young age. The youngest person she spoke to was 4 years old, and it was a 4-year-old boy, and he was able to articulate safety planning in a way that we often train adults to do. He could tell you, this is what I will do if the police will come. These are the tactics I will use to stay safe, and this is how I will keep my family safe. And so she argues that the trauma that people felt and experienced during Jim Crow is not only passed down through what we would call adaptive behaviors and health outcomes, but also the adaptive behaviors in how Black people interact with the police and how they stay safe, and has become embedded into all of their interactions with the police. And since the police are born out of that same systemic racism that Jim Crow was, they are reliving and re-experiencing the trauma that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents now experienced. So I know that is a lot of information and a lot to process. So I just want to take just a minute to, if you have any questions or would like clarification or even reflections that you would like to share, or if you just need 30 seconds, a minute to organize your thoughts, take a sip of water, anything like that. I just want to take a pause and acknowledge I just dumped a bunch of information on you. So if anyone has any questions that are coming up right now, please feel free to type those in or raise your hand, and I'm happy to address them now. Or if you, again, just need to take a pause. Don't see anything, so. Oh, is there a connect? Oh, so Greg asked if there is a connection to trauma that is passed on a molecular level. The research is out there regarding what is called epigenetics, and we are actually going to talk about that in a couple of slides. But a short answer, probably. And when we get to that slide, I'll do a bit of a deeper dive into that. So to address then this larger systemic historical incidents, Dr. Thompson Miller showed in her work, and we have seen in other more concentrated studies that, and also just in living in this country and seeing what is on the news, we know that these historical incidents, they don't just disappear, right? You know, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, slavery didn't just poof into thin air, and nor did the people who created and sustained and, you know, thrived off of slavery. Those people still existed, and we're still in power and creating systems. And so what Dr. Thompson Miller's work shows us and others show us is, you know, these interactions remind us that the systems that were in place to create mass historical trauma are still influencing systems today. So this timeline from the Center on Community Resilience at George Washington University shows us, you know, there's this deeply embedded and systemic structure behind historical trauma. And there isn't a linear beginning and end point to many of them, but rather an evolution. So we see these layers. So we have the colonial era and we have slavery and Reconstruction, but at the same, it didn't just disappear, right? We go into segregation and Jim Crow, and then, you know, we pass the Voting Rights Act and we have the Civil Rights era, but then we evolve into the war on drugs and the mass incarceration that we see, and we have, you know, the crime bill that has sort of dominated a lot of political talk in the 90s. And now we see an even further evolution of that with war on immigrants and war on color, and how that is combining with this built-in systemic racism. And so it's important to remember this, because, you know, when we talk about historical traumas, very often people say like, oh, well, that was such a long time ago, get over it. But it wasn't a long time ago, both in years, but also it still exists. It's just evolved. And so we always need to remember that the systems in place are designed for the outcomes we see. When people say the system is broken, very often they are incorrect. Very often systems are working the way they were designed. And so when we see individual outcomes and individual behaviors, we always need to keep that in mind, because people are only reacting to the systems in which they live. And we see that through the perpetuation of community trauma. So community trauma is, as the name suggests, the trauma seen in communities that are impacted by violence, poverty, lack of resources. It not only affects individual outcomes, but relationships with each other, a cohesion of a community, you know, how invested and safe people feel in their community. And it can manifest on multiple levels, physical and built environment, so how a community physically looks, the economic environment, so lack of jobs, commercial activity, financial investment, and then the socio-cultural environment. So again, that cohesion and investment, feeling connected and safe with your neighbors, the ability to take action or feeling like you have power and control over the destiny of your community. That is all a part of community trauma. And it in turn also impacts how outsiders' perceptions of communities are formed, because they are just as impacted by these systemic issues that create trauma as those who survive it. But their biases and opinions and thoughts and prejudices towards both individuals and communities are being formed by the same systems. And I say that not to absolve people of individual responsibility, but again, just to create that framework of things don't just appear. None of this is created in a vacuum. And so it is, again, part of that cycle of trauma rooted in historical trauma and the racism and prejudices that created. So here in Chicago, if you think back to what Dr. Thompson Miller said about the Great Migration being, you know, akin to a refugee or an internally displaced people's crisis, a wave of people who had experienced severe trauma moved into Chicago, and when they arrived were met with more trauma from white flight, from disinvestment, from actual physical violence from residents and the police. They were denied resources, they were victims of mortgage fraud, redlining, purposeful, you know, displacement, purposeful disinvestment and degradation within the community by outsiders. And so that only led to more trauma within a community. And it also allowed outsiders to have, you know, confirmation bias for their racism. People don't care about their neighborhoods. Where are the parents? These things that we often hear, those are the results of their inflicting trauma on other people. So they use those excuses that they have created, though, these perpetrators of trauma, to use their power and privilege to continue traumatizing communities through, again, lack of resources, like closing schools or shutting down economic opportunities, police violence, as we continuously see in this city. Also, items like the child welfare system that penalize trauma. We tell parents there's only one way to parent, and if you don't do it, we will remove your children from it. And that one way to parent has been framed and informed, again, by these larger systems. And then, again, to emphasize, the system was purposefully built and thus has to be purposefully dismantled. It can only be confronting explicit acts of racism and oppression, but it also has to be about confronting ones we may not even be aware of. And I say that in acknowledgement of even myself. We are always undoing the racist system in which we have been raised in and even born in, as we'll talk about with health outcomes. And so it's important to also keep that in mind when we talk about these larger systemic traumas, that it is not just enough to address the head-on, very overt act of trauma, but also the systems that create it. And we need to do that because of items like implicit bias. So the people, as I said, the people and systems that create these traumas, they don't disappear, right? And we also know that people who we would not call openly discriminatory, we know they're also not immune to the systems and the effects of those systems and the perceptions they create. So historical incidents and cultures that create trauma are embedded throughout society and perpetuate trauma and the health and social outcomes we see, not only through those explicit acts, but also through implicit bias. So these are unconscious and activated without an individual's awareness, but it impacts their perception and behavior towards others, and in turn perpetuates trauma. We don't know often that we are doing it, and we often have implicit biases that don't align with our declared beliefs or reflect stances that we would explicitly endorse. We generally hold implicit biases that favor our own group, but you can have multiple biases and multiple perceptions. But we also know that they're malleable because our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we have formed can be unlearned. So we can first identify our implicit biases and then work to unlearn them, but they are pervasive from even birth. We are taught how to categorize things, but in doing so, we also start ranking things and start assigning value to things. And it's presented to us at an incredibly early age. Children's television favors light-skinned performers and Eurocentric storytelling. It also has a lack of Black actors and teachers within most students' lives. So even from a very early age, if children are taught that one presentation is good, but then not given exposure to another presentation, they will learn to categorize, even within the deep recesses of their mind, as bad. This happens even with something as seemingly benign as Disney princesses. And you see that through things like the doll study, where children were asked to choose between two dolls, one white and one black, and assign characteristics like good and pretty or bad and ugly. And children, regardless of background, overwhelmingly assigned negative characteristics to the black doll, in positive ones to white dolls. When asked to explain why, many just said, "I don't know, she just is," either pretty or ugly. And so that's on a very benign level, but that gets built in deep to us to the point where it can impact health and social outcomes of individuals and entire communities. So a 2018 study found that pre-service teachers, so these were teachers right before they graduated and went out to schools, they were given two separate essays that were identical and were told that one was written by a white student and one was written by a Latinx migrant student. And they were identical essays, but they still they still graded statistically significantly worse than that of a student without the migrant background. So just by being told a migrant student wrote this, they graded that student more harshly without any reasoning behind it. A similar study for doctors showed pediatricians' implicit racial biases affect treatment recommendations. And this is where we really start to see health outcomes be significantly impacted by biases. Results from a pediatrician survey indicated that pro-white implicit biases, as they increased, respondents were more likely to categorize Black children as difficult, or presume that the examples they were given were faking or exaggerating their symptoms. They were also more likely to prescribe painkillers and additional tests or treatment for patients they perceived to be white in these examples, and then less likely to give medication to Black children. And so these are just, they were given examples of patients, but if this is what they're doing on paper, what are they doing when they are out practicing medicine? And so when we talk about those health outcomes too, it's not just individual adaptive behaviors that are influencing it. It's also the behaviors and biases of the people that are entrusted to take care of them and entrusted to help people thrive. And again, when we talk about historical trauma, we cannot divorce the survivors of that trauma from the perpetrators and their descendants. We cannot say historical trauma only happens to these groups of people and they're the only ones impacted by it, because we know that historical traumas and the systems that created them are also impacting our perceptions as teachers, social workers, doctors, lawyers, all of these people who have significant influence over people's lives. And so we are constantly being shaped by that. So I'm going to share a video with everyone. So I'm going to pause screen share for just a second here. And this video that we're going to watch discusses how certain adaptive behaviors pop up and then how we in turn as educators might demonize those behaviors or view them as maladaptive. Share my screen again. And thank you all for your patience with this technology. There we go. should also be able to. I'm going to turn on closed captions just in case folks can't hear, but.
Trauma continue, yes. So 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long, enduring trauma. So I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African-American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid, he's shiftless, he can't work, because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, you know, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You socialize. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
So I show that video not only to summarize a lot of what we've talked about, but one thing that she mentions and we'll talk about more too is this idea of both, right? The response has to be twofold, both as an individual, but also systemic. But then I also share this a lot of times with teachers and folks who work with kids because of what she says about the mother's behavior and how that might be perceived. Because thinking about that and how we, like I said earlier, have criminalized motherhood for Black women and Latinos, and how we have utilized the foster care system and the education system to perpetuate trauma. So thinking about that when we interact with communities and interact with individuals, and how I, as a social worker, educators on here, or other folks who work with communities, you know, what are we actually reacting to? Are we reacting to an individual who perhaps isn't acknowledging her son's achievements? Or are we reacting to, as Dr. DeGray says, an adaptive behavior, an appropriate one at that? And so how can we reframe the way we respond to these adaptive behaviors? So if we were all in person, you would all have a little handout in front of you where I would ask you to take a couple of minutes or seconds even to just think about the shape of your reflection, as we call it. So what 3 points have stood out? What's squared with your thinking? You know, what has really resonated and you're like, oh yeah, I knew that, or that makes a lot of sense based on what I've seen. And then also, what's still circling around? What do you still have questions about? And you can either raise your hand or share in the chat or just think about it for yourself, but keeping that in mind as we go into this next part. And we talk about like the actual statistical health outcomes, like thinking about how is this framing impacting the learning for the people I work with, but also for me and my organization. You know, what am I still thinking about and how do I want to utilize this information? So again, I welcome if you want to share anything in the chat or raise your hand, but just to keep these things in mind as we move forward in this next section. And that is with the actual health and social outcomes. So how do we take all of this knowledge and all of these like pieces and connect them with the quantifiable data that we are seeing related to health, but then also the social outcomes that we're seeing in the communities that we serve or in our own families and neighborhoods, and how do we actually, you know, operationalize this knowledge? So again, a couple more health outcomes that have, in the years since those original studies around historical trauma, have been connected or correlated with high rates of shared historical trauma. Those descendants of Holocaust survivors, I mentioned having higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation than the general population, or even people of similar backgrounds who are not Holocaust, the descendants of Holocaust survivors, so other Jewish or Roma Americans. Here in the United States, an estimated 70% of Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, and First Nations members have a diagnosable mental illness, it's estimated. The US Indigenous community has a suicide rate 3.5 times that of the national average, and the professor I mentioned at the University of Minnesota earlier, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, she has done a significant amount of research into Indigenous peoples and historical trauma. And so if that is of interest to you, I highly recommend her work. We also know that 42% of Black American males experience hypertension in their lifetime versus only 25% of white American males, regardless of lifestyle. So hypertension is, related to heart disease and is often associated with diet and exercise and things of that nature. But even accounting for that, they still were seen to have much higher rates of hypertension, stress on their heart. And those who were surveyed on it and asked about experiences with racism and other associated traumas, such as incidents with police or feeling microaggressions at work, all of those population of men were more likely to be diagnosed with hypertension. And then something that is of particular interest, I think, and something that has gotten some attention recently, but still needs more, is the maternal mortality rate of Black American women, 3 times as likely to die in childbirth as white American women. And so with that statistic in particular, I encourage you to think back to those implicit biases and think and what we know about doctors and in that study, pediatricians, and how they believe their patients and how this manifests regardless of income or class or access to care even. It made the news a few years ago when Serena Williams gave birth that she experienced complications and tried to alert her doctors, and they did not believe her. And it wasn't until she was able to find a Black nurse that she was given the treatment that she needed. And it was related to a blood clot. So she could have died in childbirth. And I think that is such a damning indictment of these biases that are embedded, that the most successful tennis player and one of the most successful athletes on the planet could not even have that power that you would think would be guaranteed her because of her class and her celebrity, because of the biases that doctors had due to her race. And so it's important to remember that while these, I know I've said this multiple times, but I really do think it's important, any health or social outcome we see are influenced by stress of historical trauma on individuals. They are also influenced by the biases that our systemic traumas implant in provider care and teacher care and social work care, and how that in turn perpetuates trauma and poor health outcomes. And we know that historical trauma can build up over time, but we also know that it doesn't take a long time for collective outcomes to become apparent as the result of trauma. So after the 2016 election, there were numerous reports of discrimination and violence against groups targeted by Donald Trump's campaign, particularly Latinx and Muslim South Asian communities. But there have also been significant detrimental health outcomes, even in this short time period, because 4 years is not particularly a long time in the study sense of the word. We've already still seen significant health outcomes associated with this election. Preterm births in Latino women, which can potentially influence a child's lifelong health, have been significantly impacted by the 2016 election, studies are indicating. So the study that is referenced here comes from Harvard University, which compared the preterm birth rates in New York City before and after the election, and saw that those preterm births increased slightly as a whole. As you can see, they looked at a little over 230,000 births in this time period. And they saw there was a slight increase from 7% of births to 7.3%. But they saw a significant amount of increase in Latino women in particular, particularly those who were foreign-born with Mexican or Central American ancestry. So the groups that were specifically targeted by Donald Trump during his campaign, they saw that preterm births in this population increased 15% compared to those compared to other groups. And they saw that highest in those who conceived within 28 days of the election. So women who conceived within 28 days of the election were the most likely to give birth prematurely. And they also saw an increased rate in women from the Middle East and North Africa, as well as other travel ban countries, but have called that non-significant due to the small sample. But I can tell you, I saw this presented at the American Public Health Association's conference, and Dr. David Williams, who presented it, he hypothesized that you would see, based on the numbers they got, a similar outcome in a significant increase in preterm births amongst these women as well, and women and others who have given birth. And so we know then that collective trauma does not take long to manifest. This is one small study, but it does show us that the systemic and broad trauma can have immediate effects on our health, and then in turn create a long-lasting, potentially intergenerational transmission. We've also seen increased rates of maternal health issues such as miscarriage, preterm birth, preeclampsia, stillbirth in Latinx communities where there has been wide-scale deportation activity. And this has been present in people regardless of their citizenship status. And so this is not just simply individual stress due to fear for themselves. It is living in a community that is being targeted, that is the stressor, and being part of this collective experiences. So when you think about that, and when you think about it combined with mass deportations, child separations, the conditions we hear about at the border, this is an unfolding historical trauma potentially. This is something that we see in real time. And Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, who represents the area around Naperville, she might be even some of y'all's congresswoman. She's a nurse and a public health professional, and she has called this a maliciously orchestrated public health crisis. We will be seeing the effects of not only the election, but the, decisions made by this administration for a long time, potentially, because if we see it in just this immediate study and with just this small population of people, it is reasonable to assume that this will have echoes in other communities as well. And then I know I promised this slide as well. So a quick word about epigenetics and the idea that genes, it is not only something in our behavior or social construct that gets passed down, but also that trauma can actually physically change our genetic code. And so it's a very hot topic in popular science. Some of y'all might have read an article on it. I know the New York Times has featured several in-depth articles on it over the last year or so. And so it is the study of how trauma and how our environment can influence the expression of certain pieces of our genetic code, and in turn alter them and see that reflected in future generations. And we know that our brain can be physically changed by the amount of cortisol or the amount of adrenaline, but this is getting down even deeper to that, to our genetic code. This is a very new and very emerging field. Like I said, 4 years is nothing in scientific research. Epigenetics has been theorized for a couple of decades now, and it's still considered very much in its infancy, the confirmations around it. There is promising research linking trauma to genetic mutations seen in multiple generations. It has been observed in the Netherlands with women and their children who survived a great famine post-World War II. It's also been observed in Ireland and Northern Ireland from those who have survived, whose ancestors survived the Great Famine in the 1840s and then on to the Troubles in the late 20th century. But again, it's very new and a bit controversial with a lot of biologists and geneticists. I think on the social science side of things, it's a little bit more accepted and makes a lot of sense for folks. But regardless of the genetic aspect of it, we do know that the presence of historical trauma does impact social behavior, and that can be passed down, and that traumatic experience can be passed down through generations. And so then to kind of summarize what's going on here in Chicago too, and also how this actually might impact some of the communities that y'all work with, or just how it impacts our city as a whole. Here we have two maps showing both the racial breakdown of the city of Chicago and the life expectancy for each of the community areas in the city. And this information might not be that surprising or new to a lot of y'all. And you can see there's a significant life expectancy drop from the mostly white neighborhoods on the north side, particularly those in the center north, which includes neighborhoods like the Loop, River North, Gold Coast, to largely Black neighborhoods on the south side like Inglewood, Grand Crossing, Washington Park. And for the city as a whole, Black Chicagoans have an average life expectancy that is 8.8 years less than white Chicagoans. In fact, Chicago has the greatest drop in life expectancy within 10 square miles in the entire country. If you get on the red line at Streeterville, just north of the Loop, and go 10 miles south to Inglewood, you will see that largest drop in the country. 90 years old in Streeterville to just 60 years old in Inglewood. Now, this has to do with a lack of access to care and resources, and how money and resources are given out in our city. But it is an obvious health equity issue. But I also think, thinking about all that we've talked about already, this connection between historical trauma and health outcomes, what Dr. Thompson Miller argues about those who escaped Jim Crow during the Great Migration, this isn't just a health equity issue, it's also a trauma equity issue. The burden of trauma in communities on the south and west side that we see here is enormous. So when we're discussing health outcomes or issues like community violence, you cannot separate them from the trauma that communities have faced and has had imposed on them. And so thinking back to that original ACEs study we talked about in the beginning, this was a mostly white, middle-class, educated, had access to the best healthcare at the time. They were all members of a managed care company in California. These are people that had all the resources available to them at their fingertips, even those people still saw a significant drop in life expectancy with 6 or more ACEs, 20 years potentially. And we know those aren't the only types of trauma. We know those 10 don't cover everything. And we also know that there are systemic issues that disproportionately affect these communities in Chicago. Policing, as we have continuously seen on the news recently. We know that ICE and other, federal policing is also present in these communities. We know that redlining, disinvestment in schools, infrastructure, everyday experiences with racism, xenophobia, all of these have the potential to also inflict trauma on people and have those physical manifestations. So if people who have it all on paper, have all those resources to a healthy life and have all of those resources available to them, if they're impacted by a trauma, imagine the impact of those additional traumas, historical and current structural ones on health. So when we see maps like this and we talk about health equity, we also need to remember that environments that cause these disparities, they're not created in a vacuum. And they're the result, again, I feel like I keep saying it, but I really do want to emphasize it. They're the result of centuries of systemic building and trauma that are meant to perpetuate trauma. And we also see that just here in schools as well and on an individual level. So these are from a University of Chicago report looking at CPS discipline practices from 2012 to 2014. And the report was released in 2015 and actually led to a change in discipline practices within CPS schools, because at the time they found that Black students were more likely to be suspended than any other group in Chicago. And that was even those who had no income, what they called incoming disadvantages. So that meant ACEs, that meant coming from a home where they perhaps did not have both parents or two adults, or they were kids who on paper again had resources, but even that did not mitigate the effects of the biases that they experienced. So, and the maps of schools with the highest rates of disciplines lined up with those life expectancy neighborhoods. And they were located in the poorest ones in the city with the ones, and also had the highest rates of exclusionary discipline practices. So those are kids that are getting suspended or expelled. And they reported high levels of stress maintaining disciplines and said that they needed these exclusionary practices to regain control, and acknowledged they weren't long-term solutions, but were said, what else am I supposed to do? And when they were asked about parent involvement, said, very often reported they didn't think a parent would be a productive partner in the discipline process. And this might not be new information to you, and it might line up with things that you've seen at your job or with your community or just on the news, but I want to share this because of that educator feedback and emphasize, thinking back to the video of how all of this is connected. Why do they assume that parents would not be a productive partner in a disciplining process? What's helping form that opinion? And so when you're thinking about trauma and structures and all of that in your work, remember that, these are all coming together, right? And you may not have a parent in front of you who is an unproductive partner. You have a parent who has the adaptive behaviors they need to survive. And CPS changed its disciplinary process after this report. It stopped doing exclusionary discipline procedures as much because they saw this great disparity. But we also know that's still very present within public schools, not just here in Chicago, but throughout the country. And so thinking about how we interact with kids and their behaviors and why we assume malicious intentions behind certain behaviors within groups. Also, it's seemingly impossible to escape the pandemic, and we are already seeing how disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 Black and Latinx Americans are. And we know that not only in the rates of people who are getting sick. So 52% of national cases in, in Chicago, rather, 52% of cases here in Chicago are Black patients, even though Chicagoans only make up, Black Chicagoans are only 33% of the city's population. They've also had difficulty in obtaining numbers around Latinx communities, but we know that nearly 65% who have been tested for COVID test positive versus only 20% in whites. And so there's a higher positivity rate. You're more likely to have it. And we also know that both of these groups are disproportionately represented in fields that would be designated essential and exposed to the virus. So thinking back to what we know, all of the things we've talked about and all of the burdens we've talked about, and now adding COVID, plus the things like schools potentially not reopening, might have lost your job, all of these things that are emerging from the pandemic, how might the collective national trauma of COVID-19 be affecting them? And Harvard, again, has done significant work around this already and is talking about how this collective trauma of COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting Black and Latinx Americans, and thus has to be addressed differently, and also addressed, period, for these communities. And that we see that here in Chicago with the results of who is getting sick. But with all that said, I don't want to undersell the power of collective resilience and survival and activism. We know there are vast disparities and structural inequities in the city. We know that certain neighborhoods get a lot of resources and other neighborhoods get none. We know that, but we also know that this city is full of peoples and communities who have exactly the right knowledge and expertise to build resilient and thriving communities. And every story of historical trauma and structural trauma also includes a story of historical resilience and adaptation. And we should celebrate that in Chicago, in the country. And we should do that by pushing forward the voices of people who are expert in their own lived experience and that of their grandparents and great-grandparents and so on before them. And so if you were in that training last week, you might remember me saying there are no maladaptive behaviors, only adaptive ones. And that is true here as well. So it's all about listening and learning from communities to hear what they need to promote thriving, wellness, healing. Because when people are given the tools, as we heard in the video, they have ideas. They feel very empowered by this knowledge. And that's on an individual level, but also communities. People know what they need. And so that is what we should be focusing on when we talk about restructuring systems. And so again, addressing that collective trauma and building collective resilience. Knowledge is power. I know this is a heavy presentation and it's not meant to make you feel hopeless or like there's nothing you can do. You know, a lot of times people hear about historical trauma and they say, well, slavery was so long ago, like I can't do anything about it now. And that's not what we want you to walk away with. What I hope you're going to walk away with, though, is a new way of looking at behavior, individual behaviors, community behaviors, you know, community practices and outcomes, and just reframing that and provide a jumping off point for your own individual trauma-informed practices to work hand in hand with the ideas of social and racial justice and equity, and learning how one cannot exist without the other. There is no trauma-informed practice without racial equity. And so, again, this is just to provide a framework around that. We know that cultural respect and continuity is vital. As we've said, listening and learning from a community. People know what's best for them and also know their own strengths and what's been passed down to help survival. You know, Dr. Thompson Miller talked about that both in the context of trauma, but also in keeping people safe. And so think about how those survival tactics can be framed into resilience building, or what you can provide to folks that they know they need to promote and build and thrive. And like I said, for every trauma history, there is also a survival history. There is also a history of resilience, and shared learning and leadership is an absolutely necessary part of that building block. You can advocate for trauma-informed policies that address historical and systemic wrongs and promote racial equity with all levels of legislature and policymakers. So both in your organization and again on that national or state level. And then remember, it's a multi-level response, as Dr. DeGray said. This is clinical and structural, and it can take a long time. And this is not you leave this training and you'll know exactly what to do, but you might have an idea about what to talk about or what to ask. But you're also working to undo centuries of systems and biases and outcomes. And so not to get discouraged by that. Success only happens though when you have knowledge and know how to use it. And so hopefully you'll walk away with this, even if it's just to say, I'm gonna go watch that YouTube video again, or I'm gonna read that article she mentioned and see what more information I can use to frame how I'm interacting with people. So that is the end of the presentation. I know we started a couple minutes late, so I am happy to stay on for a couple of minutes. And if you have any questions or thoughts, or if you need to marinate for a while and want to follow up, I'm also happy to answer anything through email as well. So here is my email address, and that is our website.